They were called flying coffins, metal death traps that sent thousands of young Americans to their graves. Yet somehow, these same machines carved a path of fire across Hitler's Europe, turning terror into dominance. This is the story of how a doomed bomber force became the deadliest strike arm of the Allied war. Europe, 1942. A continent under occupation, carved into killing zones by Nazi Germany's vast war machine. Across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, a latticework of Wurzburg and Freya radar stations swept the skies. Below them, along the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, thousands of 88mm flak guns bristled like steel thorns. And in the air, at the peak of their power, the fighter wings of the Luftwaffe, Jagdgeschwader 26, Jagdgeschwader 2, Jagdgeschwader 1, prowled with deadly discipline, waiting for anything bold or foolish enough to approach in daylight. Into this world came the Americans. The 8th Air Force arrived in England with a doctrine as ambitious as it was controversial: daylight precision bombing. The RAF warned them it was suicide. They had already abandoned daylight raids after catastrophic losses in 1940-41. But the United States Army Air Forces believed their new heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, could survive what British crews no longer dared attempt. 4 engines, thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, 13.50 caliber machine guns arranged in overlapping cones of fire. It looked flawless on paper. But war doesn't happen on paper. By late 1942, the Germans had learned to read bomber formations like an open book. Radar stations tracked them long before they reached the coast. Flak controllers walked barrages directly into their path. And when the bombers broke formation, even slightly, the Luftwaffe moved in, slicing through gaps with the precision of surgeons. Survival began to depend not on skill or strength, but luck. The crews at the 8th Air Force stations across East Anglia began to understand this long before the generals did. Men joked about flying fortresses, but in the silence of pre-dawn briefings, another phrase had begun to spread: flying coffins. Statistically, it wasn't far off. In some groups, the odds of finishing a 25-mission tour hovered so low that the empty bunk spaces after each raid became a grim reminder of how fragile a man's life was at 20,000 feet. Among the waist gunners, the exposed, unarmored defenders of the bomber's midsection, the fear was quiet, constant, and rational. One such gunner from the 100th Bomb Group wrote in a letter never mailed, found later in the bottom of a footlocker, "The air is full of things trying to kill us. And they're getting better at it." He wasn't wrong. All of this reached its breaking point on August 17, 1943. The Schweinfurt Regensburg raid was supposed to cripple Germany's ball bearing and aircraft production. The plan was audacious: 2 massive bomber streams, separated in time but not intent, striking deep inside Germany. Regensburg's Messerschmitt factories first, Schweinfurt's bearing plant second. But German radar saw them coming almost immediately. Over Belgium, fighters of JG-26 tore into the lead formations. A murderous running battle followed the bombers across hundreds of miles. FW-190s and Bf-109s attacked in coordinated waves, diving from out of the sun, striking from below the nose blind spots, hammering gunned-out stragglers until they fell burning into fields and forests. Then came the flak, the black, oily bursts of the Ruhr belts, detonating at calculated altitudes, sending shrapnel cutting through aluminum skins and human bodies alike. By the end of the day, 60 American bombers were gone. More than 600 airmen were killed, missing, or captured. Entire squadrons were mauled so badly that their flight lines looked gutted, maintenance tents silent, mess halls half empty. For the survivors, the trauma was immediate and visible. Waist gunners walked the length of their ship after landing, counting the holes and imagining how many had been inches from their spine. Pilots sat in their cockpits after shutdown, staring at the empty crew seats behind them. Chaplain services overflowed that night. Men lined up to hand over sealed letters: "Only deliver this if I don't come back." Some hands shook. None of the faces showed fear out loud. Not because they were fearless, but because fear had become a constant companion, something too familiar to name. Behind closed doors, generals debated whether the doctrine of daylight precision bombing was breaking the very force meant to deliver it. In the barracks, the men whispered that they were being fed into a grinder, one made not of steel, but of strategy. Yet, buried inside the wreckage of Schweinfurt, Regensburg, something else was forming. A shift. Mechanical, tactical, and human. Long-range escort fighters were coming. New defensive tactics were being drafted. New leadership was stepping forward. But in the summer of 1943, no one, Not the generals, not the crews, not the men staring at the empty cots of absent friends, could see that change yet. All they saw was death in daylight. High above Europe, where the air thins into a pale, icy void, the American heavy bomber was never the invincible fortress it appeared to be on factory posters. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were engineering triumphs, but they were also machines built around compromises, vulnerabilities, and hard realities of wartime production. To the men who flew inside them, they were as much coffins as they were weapons. Their skin was the first betrayal. Both bombers were wrapped in thin, stressed aluminum, less than 1/4 of an inch thick in most places. It was designed to save weight, to increase range, to allow the aircraft to carry the thousands of pounds of bombs demanded by the doctrine of daylight precision. But to enemy cannon shells, to jagged pieces of flak, and even to the simple force of ice forming at altitude, that aluminum tore like paper. A single 20mm round from an FW-190 could punch through both sides of the fuselage, sending fragments of metal and insulation into the crew. Flak bursts tore open holes so large that waist gunners could see daylight through the opposite side. Sometimes the blast ripped oxygen lines loose, and in the oxygen-rich environment of 25,000 feet, a spark could turn a section of the bomber into a fireball. The men inside felt those weaknesses every minute of every mission. Temperatures in the unpressurized cabins regularly plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. Even with electrically heated suits, frostbite was routine. Exposed waist gunners leaned into the slipstream, their hands stiffening around the grips of their .50 caliber Brownings. At those temperatures, gun lubricants thickened into sludge, weapons jammed in the middle of combat, leaving the crews helpless as fighters closed in. The cold didn't just numb flesh, it killed. Flight surgeons recorded cases where returning airmen had frozen wounds, injuries so cold that blood did not flow until the men were inside the warmth of a medical truck. Plexiglass windows shattered like spun sugar. Turrets locked up. Hydraulic lines burst when shrapnel severed them. A bomber could fly home trailing hydraulic fluid, its brakes useless, its landing gear barely held in place by manual crank and hope. And yet, these same machines could endure punishment that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. The B-17's internal structure, a robust box frame, allowed it to lose vast sections of its tail or wing and still maintain flight. The B-24's Davis wing, fragile in appearance, gave it remarkable lift, allowing it to limp home on failing engines. 4 power plants meant redundancy. Even with 1, sometimes 2 engines burning or torn away, a skilled crew could coax the bomber across the channel. There were recorded cases of B-17s flying home with over 200 holes in their fuselage. Crews from the 305th Bomb Group joked grimly that the only thing holding their planes together was air pressure and prayer. But survival required more than metal. It demanded superhuman endurance. At high altitude, oxygen masks were lifelines. If a single valve froze, or a line was shattered by shrapnel, unconsciousness followed within seconds. Countless airmen were found slumped over their guns, frost forming on the inside of their masks, saved only because a crewmate noticed in time and plugged them into a spare outlet. In other cases, no one noticed. The cold made the dying strangely quiet. Beyond the physical dangers, there was a far heavier burden, the moral weight of the missions themselves. Precision bombing in theory meant striking factories and infrastructure. In practice, weather, flak, and German defenses often scattered formations before they reached the target. Bombs fell into rail yards, streets, and homes. Crews wrote in diaries about the growing dissonance, the contrast between briefings that spoke of industrial targets and gun camera footage showing burning neighborhoods. Yet they flew again the next morning. Duty, fear of letting down the men beside them, and the belief, repeated endlessly by commanders, that destroying Germany's war industry would shorten the conflict. Each justification helped insulate them from the guilt, but never erased it. Still, the brutal truth remained. No matter how strong the B-17 or B-24 was, no matter how many engines they could lose and still limp home, 1943 was a year the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Their fighters, their flak networks, their radar, and their tactics were killing American bombers faster than factories in Seattle, Fort Worth, and San Diego could replace them. Durability was no longer enough. The skies over Europe had become a mathematics of death. One America was losing. And deep within the halls of the 8th Air Force, commanders began searching for something new. Not a machine. Not armor. Not more guns. A tactic, one that would change the air war forever. In early 1944, the skies over Europe were still a graveyard for American bombers. Every mile past the German frontier tightened the noose. The Luftwaffe's fighter wings, Jagdgeschwader 26, Jagdgeschwader 54, Jagdgeschwader 1, waited with deadly patience. Their tactics were refined through years of combat: climb above the bomber streams, form circling patterns of rotating fighters, then dive in disciplined, overlapping attacks. Crews called them murder circles. For the B-17s and B-24s, the pattern was always the same. U.S. escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, would guard them during the early phase of their journey, but as the bombers pushed deeper into Germany, fuel forced the escorts to turn home. And every man aboard a heavy bomber knew the exact moment that protection vanished. Radar operators in Germany did too. As soon as the escorts peeled away, Luftwaffe ground controllers sent the signal, "Frei Jagd." Free hunt. The bomber formations braced themselves, knowing the next hours would be a blur of cannon fire, burning engines, and falling aircraft. America needed a miracle. And in 1944, it arrived. The North American P-51 Mustang entered combat with a combination that changed everything: range, speed, firepower, and agility. Equipped with external drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers on full round-trip missions, from England to Berlin and back. What had been impossible only months before was suddenly routine. For the first time, the bombers were not alone. With the Mustangs came a new doctrine: offensive escort. Fighter groups of the 8th Air Force were no longer told to simply stay near the bombers. They were unleashed. P-51s strafed Luftwaffe airfields before interceptors could take off. They roamed ahead of bomber formations, clearing the skies. They chased German fighters into their own landing patterns, catching aces like Eggenmeyer and Hauptmann Wilhelm Steinmann in moments of vulnerability. The effect was immediate and devastating. In February and March of 1944, during what historians now call the Big Week, the Luftwaffe suffered some of the most catastrophic pilot losses of the entire war. U.S. fighter groups claimed hundreds of victories. The loss of experienced German pilots, many with over 5 years of combat, crippled the Reich's ability to defend its airspace. Bomber crews, who had once braced for slaughter when crossing into Germany, began watching something extraordinary: Mustangs diving out of the sun to break up enemy attacks before they even formed. The psychological shift was seismic. Pilots of the 4th, 352nd, and 357th fighter groups flew so close to the bomber formations that waist gunners could see the frost around their canopy frames, could see the pilots' heads turning, searching for threats. One B-17 navigator wrote, "For the first time, I looked out the window and saw someone hunting for me instead of hunting me." Escort fighters even changed how aircrews faced disaster. Before the Mustang era, a crippled bomber spiraling down meant a death sentence. German fighters followed damaged aircraft to the ground, firing until the bomber broke apart or exploded. After Mustangs arrived, escorts chased those predators away. Damaged B-17s limping home on 1 or 2 engines found P-51s sliding into formation beside them, guarding their descent. There were missions where single Mustangs orbited a crash site, warding off enemy fighters until the bomber hit the ground, giving crews precious seconds to bail out. Every bomber crewman understood what that meant: survival. Loss rates reflected the change. In late 1943, some deep penetration missions saw casualty rates of up to 20%. By spring 1944, after the widespread introduction of Mustangs, American bomber losses dropped dramatically, even as they pushed farther into Germany and hit more critical industrial targets. But the revolution was more than statistics. It was a shift in the entire balance of the air war. German fighter Gruppen could no longer mass uninterrupted for coordinated attacks. Their formations were scattered by long-range escorts before they reached the bomber streams. Luftwaffe airfields became battlegrounds, their parked aircraft shredded by strafing runs. Many of the replacement pilots hurried into service after 1944 barely survived their first engagements, facing opponents with superior numbers, training, and machines. The strategic implications were enormous. With fewer bombers falling, the 8th Air Force could send larger formations against targets previously considered too dangerous: aircraft factories, synthetic fuel plants, communications hubs, the industrial lifelines of Nazi Germany. And with each mission, the bombers pushed deeper, protected, relentless, and increasingly confident. For the airmen who once whispered about flying coffins, the change was nothing short of transformational. Their odds improved. Their missions gained momentum. The skies that had once been ruled by the Luftwaffe were shifting, hour by hour, into Allied control. By mid-1944, one truth was undeniable. With fighters guarding their approach, the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were no longer hunted. They had become the spear point, and the next phase of destruction was about to begin. By 1944, the balance in the European sky had shifted. The Luftwaffe was bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them, and American escort fighters roamed the air with growing confidence. But the strategic war was far from won. Germany's factories, buried in cities, forests, and deep valleys, still fueled the Third Reich's ability to fight. To break that machine, the Allies launched a campaign unlike anything seen before. In February 1944, Operation Argument began, a 6-day assault later known simply as Big Week. More than 3,500 bomber sorties were flown by the 8th and 15th Air Forces. Targets stretched across the Reich. Aircraft plants in Leipzig, Regensburg, Augsburg, Gotha, and Bernburg. Assembly lines turning out Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s, the fighters that had slaughtered American crews months earlier. The strategy was brutal, direct, and unrelenting. Overwhelm German air defenses, destroy the factories producing their fighters, and lure what remained of the Luftwaffe into battle where the new long-range escorts could finish the job. American bombers were now deadly not only because they were protected, but because they had finally mastered the art of precision at scale. At the heart of that precision was the Norden bomb sight, a gyro-stabilized optical system that compensated for wind drift and aircraft movement. It allowed trained bombardiers to calculate the exact release point needed for bombs to strike a target from over 5 miles in the air. It wasn't perfect. Cloud cover, flak bursts, and evasive maneuvering all affected accuracy, but in ideal conditions it allowed a formation to hit within a narrow footprint instead of scattering bombs across an entire city. Layered atop this technology was the formation itself. Bomber boxes stacked at multiple altitudes created overlapping arcs of .50 caliber fire. Any attacking fighter diving into the formation was met with a storm of metal, a coordinated defensive web that turned the sky into a killing ground. For German pilots, the airspace above their homeland had transformed. What had once been isolated streams of vulnerable bombers were now fortified aerial fortresses, escorted by Mustangs, shooting back with a density of fire unparalleled in aviation history. But inside those aircraft, the cost was still deeply human. Bombardiers, men hunched over the Norden's eyepiece, staring through drifting smoke and cloud, saw more than just factory roofs. They recognized targets from briefing photos, wing sections on assembly lines, engine blocks for the same Fw-190s that had torn through their squadrons. One bombardier wrote home after Big Week, "I watched the bombs fall and wondered whose life on our side they might save." Yet guilt never vanished entirely. Even with careful aiming, bombs fell wide when weather closed in or formations broke under flak. Some crews returned to bases in East Anglia silent, carrying the weight of civilian casualties they could neither see nor prevent. Still, Big Week accomplished what planners hoped, and more. German aircraft production dropped sharply. Critical factories in Regensburg and Leipzig were devastated. Skilled laborists were killed, machinery destroyed, assembly lines halted. Even when production resumed, shortages of aluminum, ball bearings, and trained pilots made recovery impossible. The Luftwaffe entered 1944 weakened, fractured, and increasingly unable to defend the Reich. For the first time since the war began, American bombers were not merely surviving deep penetration missions, they were shaping the destiny of the conflict. Every destroyed engine plant, every shattered wing assembly meant fewer fighters in the sky. Fewer fighters meant fewer losses. And fewer losses meant more power directed at the heart of German industry. Steel was falling across the Third Reich, precise, coordinated, relentless. But even as Germany reeled from the destruction of its aircraft factories, the air campaign was not yet over. Ahead lay the most fortified city in the Reich, protected by towering flak batteries, concrete fortresses, and the last elite defenders of Hitler's crumbling empire. A final barrier stood between the bombers and victory. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final, brutal act. Yet for the air crews of the 8th Air Force, the path to victory ran straight through the most dangerous target on the continent, Berlin. The German capital, once the beating heart of Hitler's empire, was now a fortress of smoke, fire, and anti-aircraft guns. And still, the bombers came. In waves so large that the sky itself seemed to vibrate under their wings. On certain mornings, more than 1,000 American heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, climbed into formation over England. Their engines rumbled in a synchronized thunder heard across the countryside. Crews checked oxygen lines, loaded the last belts of .50 cal ammunition, and braced themselves for the long, cold flight east. They knew what lay ahead. Berlin was defended by the most concentrated flak batteries in the world. German gunners called their killing zone the Schwarze Corridor, the Black Corridor. Inside it, altitude offered no safety, experience offered no immunity. Only luck, discipline, and a sturdy airframe kept a bomber alive. As the formations neared the German capital, the sky darkened, not from clouds, but from the burning industrial districts already struck by earlier waves. Flames rose from rail yards, oil depots, and the government quarter. Huge columns of smoke twisted upward, turning daylight into a grey twilight. The bombers descended into it, one formation after another, until the city below disappeared beneath a boiling sea of ash and debris. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them. Once, Berlin raids meant swarms of Bf-109s and Fw-190s tearing through the bomber streams. But by 1945, the German fighter force was a shadow of what it had been. Fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and catastrophic losses had thinned their ranks. Still, those few who remained were among the best. Veterans of the Eastern Front. Survivors of years of attrition. Men who refused to yield their skies without a fight. They climbed through the murk, attacking from sunward angles, firing short, precise bursts. A B-17 spiraled down with 2 engines aflame. A Liberator drifted out of formation, its tail turret silent. Yet the bombers closed their ranks, held formation, and pushed on. Among them was one of the youngest aircraft commanders in the 8th Air Force, a 21-year-old pilot, exhausted but steady at the controls. This was his 35th mission, the final hurdle before he would be allowed to return home. Regulations stated that an airman who survived 35 sorties had beaten the odds. Many never made it halfway. He checked his watch. 12 minutes to the initial point. Turrets hummed behind him. The navigator called out headings through the intercom. Below, the smoke swallowed entire neighborhoods, rail lines, and government buildings. He could feel the aircraft tremble as flak bursts hammered the formation. Each blast sent shrapnel slicing through the cold air like iron hail. And then, bombs away. The aircraft leapt upward as thousands of pounds of ordnance detached, targeting rail yards, transport hubs, administrative centers, and the industrial veins that still pumped life into the German war machine. These strikes were not symbolic. Each one choked the enemy's remaining mobility, crushed production, and shattered the myth of an untouchable capital. As the bomber banked westward, the young pilot glanced at the empty space where another squadron should have been. Holes in the formation told the quiet truth of Berlin missions. Survival was never guaranteed. He exhaled slowly, feeling both triumph and grief. He was going home, but only because fate had chosen him. Behind the retreating bombers, Berlin burned. The city Hitler once promised would stand for 1,000 years was now a landscape of ruins. Its rail lines severed, its factories silenced, its illusions shattered. The flying fortresses had entered the war as doomed metal coffins. Now, Berlin itself fell beneath their shadows. By the end of the war in Europe, one truth stood above all others. Victory in the skies had come at an unbearable cost. The men of the 8th Air Force, young, untested, many barely past their teens, had faced the deadliest environment of any American service branch. More than 26,000 U.S. airmen were killed over Europe, a toll greater than that suffered by the entire United States Marine Corps in the Pacific. Thousands more were wounded, captured, or simply never found. They died in burning fuselages, in frozen gun positions, or inside the shattered frames of the same machines the crews had come to call flying coffins. These aircraft bore that nickname not out of bitterness, but out of honesty. The B-17 and B-24 were powerful, groundbreaking bombers, but their mission placed them directly in the teeth of the enemy's strongest defenses. They flew in predictable formations, at predictable altitudes, along predictable paths. German flak gunners learned exactly where to aim. Jagdgeschwader fighter wings developed deadly head-on attack patterns that could shred an entire formation in seconds. And yet, the bombers kept flying. Because what they destroyed mattered more than anything else the Allies struck from the air. These crews obliterated synthetic fuel plants at Luna and Politz, grinding the German armored force to a halt. They smashed ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, crippling fighter production. They dismantled the transportation network, bridges, marshalling yards, rail lines, strangling Germany's ability to move men and material. Their raids forced the Luftwaffe into a desperate war of attrition, bleeding away experienced pilots who could not be replaced. Historians often note that by mid-1944, The Luftwaffe had become a hollow shell, not because it lacked aircraft, but because it lacked trained men to fly them. Every bomber lost. Every crewman killed. Every brutal mission to Berlin, Merseburg, Regensburg, or Hamburg. They all chipped away at the last strength Hitler possessed. But while the strategic results are recorded in charts and after-action reports, the human legacy is far more complex. Those who survived returned home carrying invisible weight. Some struggled with the knowledge that they lived while friends did not. Others spoke of the deafening silence inside a bomber after landing, when empty seats reminded them who wasn't coming back. Families received telegrams instead of sons. Entire communities lost entire groups of young men within months. Many airmen feared they would be forgotten. For decades, some were. But today, their flight jackets, logbooks, and even twisted fragments of fuselages sit in museums across the United States and Europe. Memorials stand at former airfields in England, quiet fields once filled with the roar of engines, now marked by stone plaques engraved with names and missions. Visitors still trace those names with their fingertips, remembering the boys who crossed oceans to fight a war they didn't start.